I shall be discussing a very important biological macromolecule, that is carbohydrates, and under this topic I shall be covering general carbohydrate chemistry. I shall also be talking very briefly about some important biological functions of carbohydrates, and in the last section I shall be discussing carbohydrate classification. So the word carbohydrate was coined by Carl Schmitt, and the literal meaning of carbohydrates is hydrates of carbon. These carbohydrates are also called as saccharides, and the word saccharides is derived from a Greek word saccharon, meaning sugar. The general empirical formula followed by many of the carbohydrates is CnH2ON, where this N could be any integer. So we can say that the term hydrates of carbon stands technically right for carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are basically composed of three elements: carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, with hydrogen and oxygen in the ratio of 2:1. However, there are some carbohydrates like raminohexose with the molecular formula of C7H14O6 and deoxyribose with the molecular formula of C5H10O4, which do not follow this empirical formula. Likewise, there are certain non-carbohydrate compounds like acetic acid with the molecular formula of C2H4O2 and lactic acid with the molecular formula of C3H6O3, which do follow this empirical formula. So, in general, we can say that all carbohydrates do not follow this empirical formula. Henceforth, keeping in view the structure of carbohydrates, they can best be defined as polyhydroxy, aldehydes or ketones. That is, carbohydrates are aldehyde or ketone compounds with multiple hydroxyl groups attached to it. There are some carbohydrates also like chitin and mucopolysaccharides, which in addition to these three basic elements also contain nitrogen and sulfur in their composition. Next, let's talk about some important functions of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates serve as energy stores. They are also part of structural framework of genetic material, that is RNA and DNA, where they are present in the form of ribose and deoxyribose sugars. They are also structural element in cell wall of plants and bacteria. They also serve as cell membrane components where they mediate intercellular communication. The degradation product of carbohydrates could also be utilized for the synthesis of fatty acids, cholesterol and amino acids. Next is the classification of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are basically classified into four major groups. First is the monosaccharides. Next group is disaccharides. The third group in carbohydrate classification is oligosaccharides, and the last important group in carbohydrate classification is polysaccharides. Let's first discuss monosaccharides. Monosaccharides, and as the name defines, these are carbohydrates made up of single sugar. So they are also called as simple sugars. These monosaccharides cannot be hydrolyzed into simpler carbohydrates. They are colorless, crystalline solids, soluble in water, and relatively more sweeter than any other carbohydrates. These monosaccharides can be further subdivided depending upon the number of carbon atoms in it and depending upon the functional group associated with monosaccharide. Let's first discuss monosaccharides depending upon the number of carbon atoms. If a monosaccharide is a 3-carbon sugar, it's called as triose, and the examples for it are glyceraldehyde, and dihydroxyacetone, which are the simplest of all the sugars present in nature. If the monosaccharide is a 4-carbon sugar, it's a tetrose sugar, and examples for it are erythrose and erythrulose. If a monosaccharide is 5-carbon sugar, it's a pentose sugar. Examples are ribose and ribulose. Similarly, if a monosaccharide is a 6-carbon sugar, it's a hexose sugar, and examples are glucose, fructose, mannose, and galactose. Now, talking about the functional group associated with the monosaccharide, if the functional group is aldehyde, or we can say that if aldehyde is the most oxidized functional group present in monosaccharide, then the monosaccharide is called as aldose. Similarly, if ketone is the most oxidized functional group present in monosaccharide, then the monosaccharide is called as ketose. Henceforth, combining the two together, we can say that glucose is a aldohexose, which means it is a 6-carbon sugar with aldehyde as the functionally most oxidized group, and fructose is a ketohexose, which again means that it is a 6-carbon sugar with ketone as the functionally most oxidized group in it. Next is the disaccharide, and as the name defines, these are the carbohydrates made up of 2 monosaccharide units. These disaccharides are soluble in water and they follow a general empirical formula of CnH2ON-1. Most common examples for disaccharides are lactose, which is also called as milk sugar and is made up of 1 unit of glucose and 1 unit of galactose. Another example is maltose, which is also called as malt sugar and is made up of 2 units of glucose. A very common example for disaccharide is sucrose, which is also called as cane sugar or table sugar and is composed of 1 unit of glucose and 1 unit of fructose. The third group in carbohydrate classification is oligosaccharides. These are the carbohydrates which produce 3 to 10 monosaccharides on hydrolysis. They follow a general empirical formula of C6H10O5N, where this N is equal to 3 to 10. Common examples for these oligosaccharides are ribose, stachyose, and maltotriose. Now the last group in carbohydrate classification is polysaccharides. These are the carbohydrates which produce more than 10 monosaccharides on hydrolysis. They have the general empirical formula of C6H10O5N, where this N is greater than 10. These polysaccharides are high molecular weight compounds tasteless, form collides with water and are non-reducing. They are further subdivided into homopolysaccharides, and heteropolysaccharides. Now, if we look at homopolysaccharides, these are the polysaccharides made up of single type of monosaccharide unit or its derivatives. Common example for it are chitin, cellulose, inulin, which is a polymer of fructose, starch, which is a polymer of glucose in plants, and glycogen, which is also called as animal starch and is a polymer of glucose in animals. Next is the heteropolysaccharides, which is made up of more than one type of monosaccharide units or its derivatives, and the examples for it are keratin sulfate, chondroitin sulfate, and heparin sulfate. So this was all about carbohydrate chemistry, some of its functions and its classification. In my next video, I shall be talking about glycolysis.